The boy looked at the Trunchbull. Then he looked down at the enormous cake. "Eat! Eat! Eat!" the Trunchbull was yelling. Very slowly, the boy cut himself another slice and began to eat it. Bruce Bogtrotter is my extemporaneous hero. I really like Bruce Bogtrotter because when the evil Trunchbull forces him to eat a chocolate cake in front of the entire school, he doesn't give up. He eats that chocolate cake, one slice at a time. Bruce teaches us that when we see impossible problems, it's best to divide them up into more manageable pieces. Giving an extemporaneous speech is much like eating an enormous chocolate cake in front of the entire school. In order to conquer it, you must do it one piece at a time. And also, you should probably be concerned about public humiliation and projectile vomiting. And also, my public speaking career can be perfectly summed up with this picture. Love you, Brucey. Welcome to part 2 of an introduction to extemporaneous speaking. If you have no idea who I am or what extemporaneous speaking is, check out the first video. Link in the description down below. Today we're going to answer the question, what is the structure of a typical extemporaneous speech? Well, that's the structure of a typical extemporaneous speech. But that's a pretty big chocolate cake to eat in one bite. So we'll split it up into 3 parts. The introduction, the body, and the conclusion. A quick note before we begin. Conformity is boring. But being boring is better than being incomprehensible. The purpose of the structure is to help both the judge and you, the speaker, understand what the speech is really about. Also, once you get really good at being boring, then you can start to add a little flair. And maybe a few dance moves. I'm sorry, this preamble must go on. There are numbers at the top of each section. These numbers are not just decorative. They provide a helpful timeline for each section. For example, a quality introduction should aim to last between 1 and 2 minutes, while an individual argument should be terrified in exceeding 1 minute and 45 seconds. I urge all novice extempers not to focus on time. It's easy to be terrified by 7 minutes, but if you focus on the ideas and the structure, then those 7 minutes will start to come naturally. At the end of the day, it's all about practice. I can show you the structure of an extemporaneous speech, but you're going to have to stand up in front of a room and embarrass yourself in order to figure out how that structure fits within the 7-minute time frame. So for the rest of the video, don't worry about the time. Worry about the ideas. Let's do this. All things have a beginning, and for extemporaneous, that beginning is the introduction. The purpose of the introduction is to transform the judge from, "Who is this scruffy-looking person, and what business do they have standing in front of me, the judge," into, "Ah, I like the cut of your jib, and I also understand that your speech is going to be about interesting and informative political matters." The introduction has well-defined sections, and the secret to performing an interesting, informative, and jib-cutting introduction is to nail those individual sections like a well-choreographed dance. This is the intro. Attention grabber, background, importance, lead-in, question, answer, roadmap. Extemp in large quantities is exhausting. And after listening to 6 consecutive speeches of political analysis, the mind of even the most committed judge inevitably starts to wander. So it's your job in the attention grabber to snap them back to reality. Make them forget about all those other boring extemp speakers and focus on you, the only interesting person in the room. I think there are 2 primary ways to do this. You can either reference some wacky or interesting article, or you can make a humorous simile, comparing something that's pretty mundane to something that is super not mundane. Sanctions from Saudi Arabia are the lunch detention of the international community. They're not really going to change your behavior, and they're just going to make you look cool. And hilarity ensues. It's important to remember that your judge probably doesn't know as much about religious tensions in Bolivia as you do, so it's good to provide some baseline information before getting them up to speed. So the background is a perfect opportunity to provide a citation and use that citation to provide the necessary background information to understand your entire speech. The most recent country to be on the receiving end of this international lunch detention is the small but economically very powerful Arab state of Qatar. Now, a Guardian article, May 6 of 2018, reminds us that way back in 2017, Saudi Arabia teamed up with Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and a number of other Arab and African states in order to blockade Qatar. Now, Qatar borders exactly one country, and that's Saudi Arabia. So when Saudi Arabia implemented this blockade, it removed every single land trade route going out of Qatar, forcing that country to depend entirely on maritime and air transport. Otherwise, they're just going to be lost. After providing an adequate amount of background information, it's time to make the judge care. Why does your speech matter? There are two things that most judges care about: international conflict and economic distress. If you can connect your speech to one of those two things, and unfortunately, unlike Vegas, what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. Henry Barker, director of the Middle East program for the Wilson Center, told USA Today on June 5th that with Saudi Arabia's blockade of Qatar, Qatar is turning towards Iran and Russia for support, creating two sides on the Arabian Peninsula. There's Saudi Arabia, supported by the United States, and there's Qatar, supported by Iran and Russia. The longer this blockade goes on, the higher the tensions ratchet up, and the more likely that some action could create a proxy war in the region, dragging in a number of powerful international forces. Therefore, it's an easy way to make your judge care about what you're going to say. Coming just after we've raised the stakes, the lead-in is a small but vital part of the extemp speech. And all you have to say is, and therefore it is imperative that we answer today's question. Therefore, it is imperative that we answer today's question. And don't worry, you have a lot of flexibility with the lead-in. You can replace the word imperative with one of its many synonyms, like vital, critical, or a matter of imminent life and death. After the lead-in comes the question, and this is literally just reading the question you were given at the beginning of prep. Will Saudi Arabia's blockade of Qatar end in 2019? Be prepared to memorize the question you were given. Some tournaments let you read it off of a piece of paper, and some tournaments care more about rote memorization than they do about actual arguments. After you ask the question, it's time to answer it. Simply say yes, no, followed by one sentence of explanation. This is future Mallory. Despite what my past self may have said, not every extemp question can be answered with a yes or no. Questions that begin with who, which, how, why, and wherefore require special attention. Some of these questions should be answered with one or two carefully chosen words, followed by a brief explanation. And for some, the brief explanation and the answer are the same thing. Back to you, past Mallory. Imagine you don't have 7 minutes to answer an extemp question. Instead, you have 7 seconds. In the introduction, you should answer the question with a 7-second speech. It's your core theme, your thesis, the heart and soul of the rest of your speech. The answer is unfortunately no, because none of the participants in the blockade want it to end. The roadmap is simply a list of your 3 main arguments. We haven't covered arguments yet, so this will probably make more sense after we do. But remember, your 3 arguments should all support the answer to your question. Today, we'll examine each of the international actors in the blockade, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, and come to understand why each one of them is happy letting the blockade continue. The body contains 3 arguments, each of which should support your answer. I know I won't stop talking about the answer, because the purpose of Extemp is to answer a question. In a perfect world, the three arguments have some sort of flow between them. Taglines such as past, present, future, or a city, a country, a world, make it easier for the judge to understand you and for you to remember your own arguments. But the world is far from perfect. Sometimes you're 25 minutes into preparation and you don't have a third argument, so you're forced to make do with whatever you can. We've all been there. Some of us are there more often than we want to be, and that's okay. We divide the body into three arguments, and we subdivide those arguments into their own separate pieces. It's not as tightly choreographed as the intro or the conclusion. It's more like dancing along with the radio when it's playing the BBC World Service. Transition, tagline, filling, support. The first part of an argument is the transition. It provides a buffer between arguments to help avoid points merging into some unholy mess. Inspirational speakers love to talk about never giving up. Perhaps Saudi Arabia has taken this advice a little too literally. The tagline, or tag for short, is the central idea of an argument. Be careful to avoid the pitfall trap of long taglines. Keep your taglines short and to the point. You don't even need to have a full sentence. A half sentence will do just fine. Memorization matters, and if you make your taglines too long, you will forget them. I will forget them. I always forget. If your answer is your thesis for the entire speech, then your tagline is your thesis for an individual argument. It's a mini thesis. Extemp speeches are a bit like pyramid schemes. The arguments support the taglines, and the taglines support your answer. Saudi Arabia won't end its blockade of Qatar because it cares too much about projecting strength. And your answer has all the money and power. After the transition in the tagline comes the filling. But before we get into that, I need to apologize. Because this is a Mercator representation of an extemporaneous speech. It's not necessarily a lie, it's just misleading. If I made the size of each word equivalent to its extemp speech value, then the word filling wouldn't be red size 30 Helvetica bold. It would be 100-point flashing font in the middle of the page that you literally could not ignore. Because the filling is what makes the cake tasty and is what makes the extemp speech persuasive. A filling uses logic and evidence to support the tagline and, therefore, supports the original answer. I've seen extemp speeches with inappropriate introductions, terrible taglines, and confusing conclusions still win extemp tournaments because their filling is so strong. Unfortunately, there is no universal structure for persuasion. There are as many ways to form a persuasive argument as there are things to argue about. So, it would be impossible for me to give you one structure that works for every extemp speech. But I don't really care about every extemp speech. So here's a structure that works on most extemp speeches. The source is a news or academic article you found during preparation. Hopefully it has a trustworthy sounding name, like The Hill, the BBC, or the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Foreign Policy on June 4th, 2018 explains. The source's claim is a quick summary of the part of the article that relates to your speech. It could be a statistic or a factoid. Whatever it is, it should help support your argument. Saudi Arabia has equated the success of its blockade with its strength as a country. The tagline connection is where you connect the claim with the tagline. How does that organization with the trustworthy sounding name convince us that the tagline is true? For Saudi Arabia, ending the blockade would be admitting weakness. And the Saudi government wants to avoid weakness by whatever means necessary. The example is an anecdote or comparison that further strengthens the connection between the tagline and the truth. This can be a perfect time to add a face to a statistic or provide another citation from a trustworthy sounding news source. Another example of Saudi Arabia's international stubbornness comes through its relationship with Canada. A CBC article from the 14th of February 2019 reminds us that after Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called into question Saudi Arabia's human rights record, the Saudi government shot back by implementing sanctions on Canada. And despite resistance from both Saudi citizens and the international community, the Saudi government is staying strong, keeping those sanctions on Canada in order to keep up this veneer of international stability. So, if Saudi Arabia isn't willing to resume trade with Canada, why on earth would they be willing to resume trade with Qatar, a country that is much closer to home, and one that they are much more ideologically opposed to? I found this template useful, but it is by no means the only one you can use. Mix and match things you find persuasive, or things that work for you, until you get your own speaking rhythm. You're always going to get a new extemp question, and you should always find a new, better way to answer it. The support is mercifully easy. It's just a connection between your tagline and your original answer. And honestly, the best way to do this is just to be ludicrously straightforward. My tagline supports my answer because my argument. And therefore, Saudi Arabia's blockade of Qatar will not end in 2019 because Saudi Arabia refuses to give up. Whew! That's it! Now on to the conclusion. The conclusion is the end of the speech. Its purpose is to remind the judge what you spoke about and to end your speech with grace and dignity. How nice. Sadly, conclusions constantly get forgotten. A speaker that is so excited to talk about their arguments often doesn't leave time for their planned conclusion, and they end up cutting it. It's tragic, really. When the conclusion is cut short, it tends to be less grace and dignity and more the belly flop off the high dive. With this in mind, the conclusion should aim to be a graceful belly flop. You don't need to worry about remembering a new type of format for the conclusion. It's very similar to the introduction, it's just flipped upside down. Lead in, review question, review answer, review roadmap, importance, AG. The lead in to the conclusion is a thing of beauty. No nonsense, just let's return to today's question. Let's return to today's question. Reviewing the question is wonderful as well. It's as easy as pulling out your piece of paper and reading the question word for word. If you have forgotten the question during the course of your 7-minute speech and you're not allowed to use your nice piece of paper, don't try to say it word for word. Just talk about similar ideas to the question. Pretend like you mean to not reference it, and hopefully the judge won't notice. Will Saudi Arabia's blockade of Qatar end in 2019? I've done that a lot. Reviewing the answer is very simple. It's exactly like what you did in the introduction, except you have a cool lead-in sentence, like, the answer is clearly. Today we explored how the answer is no, because none of the actors are interested in ending the blockade. Reviewing the roadmap is very similar to the introduction. You can use a full sentence to describe each one of your taglines, something that it makes it sound both interesting and impactful, and leave the judge with a positive impression of you and your speaking ability. Remember, the argument doesn't matter. It's the judge's interpretation of that argument. So if in the end you make it sound like you were neat and calm throughout, even if you were a hectic hellhole, that's okay. We examined how Qatar is benefiting from the blockade, how Saudi Arabia is too stubborn to quit, and how the United States is willing to have diplomatic relations with both sides. It's been 6 minutes since you originally described the importance of this topic, so the conclusion is a perfect opportunity to review it again. Just use 1 or 2 sentences to describe why the judge should care about what you said, and why they should care about your answer. Initial concerns about the blockade ratcheting up tensions between Qatar and Saudi Arabia have turned out to be overblown. Not because there isn't tension on the Arab Peninsula, but because both Qatar and Saudi Arabia have accepted the blockade as a new normal. Referencing your attention grabber can be a nice way to bookend your speech. Not only does it leave a smile on the judge's face, but it also makes you look like you planned everything perfectly. Saudi Arabia's blockade of Qatar has become the new normal on the Arabian Peninsula. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing for Qatar, because Qatar is perfectly willing to keep coming to lunch detention. The two most difficult aspects of extemporaneous speaking are organizing information into a comprehensible speech and presenting that speech without forgetting all the comprehensible information that you just wrote down. Having a cohesive structure solves both of these problems. It helps make extemporaneous speaking significantly less chaotic. As you do extemp more and more, you'll soon realize there are many ways to give a speech, and this is just one of them. Finding that rhythm and developing your own optimal structure is the real way to succeed, or at least to fail less poorly. When I first started Extemp, I felt like the structure was a cage. Now that I've done it a few more times, I realize that it is, in fact, a cage. It's a shark cage, one that keeps you safe from the endless ocean of uninformed rants and pointless political diatribes. Now that we've finished reviewing the structure of an Extemp speech, it's a perfect opportunity for you, the watcher of this video, to give your own. In the description of this video, there are a series of tools that'll help you get started. There's a list of questions that you can use to practice. There's a template that beginner speakers can use to help them prepare. There's a less specific template for more advanced speakers. And there's a funky little flowchart that you can print out and put on your wall. In the next video, we'll learn what on earth are we supposed to do during those 30 minutes of preparation, and why the Peterson Institute for International Economics is your new best friend. Special thanks to David Trevithek and the Colorado College Speech and Debate team. Without you, I wouldn't have the skills to teach extemporaneous speaking, or a camera to record myself. You're the best. Your structure is fighting a losing battle against chaos, and it's not a question of will it win, it's a question of how long before chaos does.